Everett Colton once said, out loud at the county fair, that a mule can't outplow a diesel engine, no matter how much folks love a story. But his shining green combine had never once found what old Ruth Bennett found on a gray October morning in the low pasture behind Hollow Pine Farm. Ruth's mules, Cedar and Duke, leaned into their harness through the drizzle, hooves sinking and lifting in the wet clay, patient in a way no machine could ever fake. The old walking plow struck something flat, a sound Ruth had learned to notice, not the dull thud of a buried rock, but something sharper, almost hollow. She knelt in the mud anyway, rain sliding down her collar, her fingers already digging before her mind caught up with her hands. Dark water rose from beneath the stone, more than any ordinary rock should have held, spreading outward across the churned earth. Far off, at the edge of a field too soft to enter, sat Everett's brand-new combine, half swallowed in mud it had tried to cross an hour before. Nobody watching that morning knew yet what the plow had actually found. If this story moves you, type your state in the comments. I want to know who's watching tonight. Now let's begin. Of the 18 mules on Ruth's small Kentucky farm, 2 always stood apart, not just for their size, but for something harder to name. Cedar was a tall bay mule with a crooked blaze down his nose and an old rope scar across his chest. Duke, his lifelong partner, was darker, steadier, the first to plant his feet whenever something wasn't right beneath the ground. The man who'd sold them to Ruth mentioned almost in passing that the pair had hauled timber together for 11 years before the logging outfit closed. Ruth had bought them on that detail alone, betting that whatever partnership carried them through hard years in the hills would carry them through her own. It hadn't come easy. The mismatch in their pull ruined more than one furrow before old instincts settled back into place. But once they found their rhythm, Cedar and Duke became heartbeat of everything that followed. The first to hesitate over buried ground, the pair Ruth trusted when the storms came, the ones who never once let her down when it mattered most. Ruth's tractor had died the winter before, its engine seizing on a field that never should have been farmed the way she'd been farming it. Repairs cost more than she had. The bank offered a new loan instead, a bigger machine. The farm itself as collateral, 60 days until the first payment came due. A machine that would only sink into the same soft bottom land and solve nothing. That same week, a shuttered logging camp 2 counties over put its mule teams up for auction. Older animals, some scarred, all considered worthless by modern standards, but trained, paired, carrying knowledge no amount of money could simply buy back once it was gone. Ruth spent nearly everything she had left on 18 of them, signing the papers at a folding table while the whole county's attention stayed fixed on Everett's gleaming combine at the front of the barn. 18 mules won't replace one good engine, Everett called out, loud enough for half the barn to hear. I'm not buying speed, I'm buying ground that finally gets listened to. Hollow Pine Farm sat on 90-some acres along Route 9, the low pasture tucked against Miller's Creek to the east, ground that had beaten every tractor Ruth's family ever owned, going back 3 generations. Beneath the surface, though nobody living had gone looking the way Ruth eventually did, ran a forgotten line of old stone drain channels, dug by hand before anyone in the county could remember, meant to pull water off that low ground and send it safely into the creek. Nobody remembered they were there. That never changed the truth of it. The first months were hard, and the story is more honest for saying so. Feed costs ran higher than Ruth had planned. 3 mules needed hoof care right away. 2 yokes cracked in the first week alone, and Ruth spent a night repairing them by lantern light instead of sleeping. Cedar and Duke themselves, the pair she'd trusted most, refused at first to pull evenly, each testing the other's forgotten rhythm, sending the plow skating sideways more than once.
Her daughter, Ellie, mucked out the pens after school on top of her chores, coming in tired every evening in a way that pressed on Ruth's chest at the dinner table. The bank's clock kept ticking underneath all of it, same 60 days, whether the mules cooperated or not. Around the county, the story took the shape everyone expected. Ruth Bennett, too proud or too broke for a real tractor, retreating into the past and calling it a plan. "Old doesn't mean wise," Everett told her once at the feed store. "Sometimes it just means worn down." For a while, it looked like he was right. Working the low pasture and slow, shallow passes, Cedar and Duke kept stopping at the same spot, a third of the way across, heads low, refusing to pull further no matter which direction Ruth approached from. She assumed fatigue at first, but other teams, on other days, slowed in that same stretch of ground too, a pattern no single tired animal could explain. Ellie started marking the spots with little wooden stakes, walking the field behind her mother. A week later, standing at the fence line, the stakes weren't scattered at all. They ran in a line, nearly straight, north to south. "Mules don't stop in a straight line by accident," Ellie said. That was the turn. Ruth hitched the old plow to Cedar and Duke and worked the marked line herself, hands on the handles, feeling for the resistance that had stopped both animals days before. The share struck stone. 20 feet later, it struck another, same spacing, same sound, until Ruth stopped the team and just stood there, letting the pattern settle into something she could no longer call coincidence. When she pried the first flat stone loose, she found a narrow, dark channel beneath it. Old moss, a fragment of broken clay pipe, green-black staining where water had clearly moved for a long, long time before it ever stopped. Walter Hale, a 74-year-old retired drainage man from the next county, walked the line with her and told her plainly what she'd found: a hand-built stone drainage system, generations old.
The kind he hadn't personally serviced in decades, but recognized instantly. Floods had silted it shut over the years. Roots had choked whole sections, and the outlet at the southern end, where it should have emptied into Miller's Creek, had sealed completely, turning a system built to carry water away into one that now trapped it in place. Infrastructure that started causing the very problem it was built to solve, Walter said. Happens more than folks think. He gave her one rule before he'd say anything else: never open the main outlet before the whole system upstream is mapped. With the bank's deadline pressing, Ruth didn't fully follow it. She told herself she'd map the rest once she confirmed the outlet was actually clear, a decision that felt reasonable in the moment and cost her dearly within hours. Alone, before Ellie had even come out that morning, Ruth pried the capstone free at the outlet. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, trapped water burst loose under real pressure, faster than anything she'd braced for, roots and silt shoving her flat into the mud. Part of the collector gave way. Instead of running toward the creek, the water surged straight for the 2-acre kitchen garden she'd planted weeks before. Rows she'd started with her own hands, buried under mud within minutes. Duke spooked at the surge and jerked sideways hard enough that Cedar came away with a raw patch on his shoulder, an injury Ruth would spend the next week treating with real guilt behind every touch. Everett saw the flooded garden from the road and stopped his truck at the fence. "You didn't find a system, you tore one open." It was hard standing there to argue he was wrong. Ruth didn't blame the rain, or Walter, or the mules. "It failed because I rushed it," she said, and that sentence carried her forward. She and Ellie remapped the whole thing properly. 2 weeks spent just tracing every line before touching another. They started at the creek and worked backwards, not from the trapped end forward. They braced weak capstones with wood before lifting them. They cleared
each channel from the downstream side, the opposite of Ruth's first rushed instinct. Cedar and Duke hauled every stone on a sledge, spreading their weight across ground no tractor could have crossed without sinking to its axles. Everett tracked how fast each reopened line drained after every rain, building a record that grew sharper with each storm. 3 spring storms were forecast that season, tracking in from the west, one after another. Everett's own low field across the creek sat exposed the same way Ruth's always had, though he'd never once wondered if his own ground might be hiding the same kind of answer. The first storm came, and 6 of the reopened lines carried water exactly as they should. Standing water still pooled in one low corner, where the last, most damaged line hadn't been fully repaired, a clear reminder of how much work remained. The second storm hit only days later. Everett's field turned into a shallow lake. His new combine sank past its axles trying to cross it, needing a tow that scarred the ground for a season. Ruth's last unfinished line held water exactly where she feared it would. With the garden threatened a second time, she went out into the storm with Cedar and Duke rather than wait for a break in the weather. Ground too soft for any machine. Wide hooves that never cut a single rut. They hauled stone in, held steady while Ruth freed the jammed capstone in slow, controlled stages, resisting every urge to rush the way she had the first time. The third storm came at night, the worst of the 3. Wind driving the rain sideways hard enough to keep a lantern lit only in short bursts. Water reached the first drain within the hour and moved south exactly the way the old stones had once intended, junction by junction, none of them failing. Ruth worked the outlet by lantern light while Ellie called out water levels from the bank, both of them soaked through, neither willing to leave until the worst had passed. By morning, the sheen of standing water had already begun to recede. It wasn't a miracle, it was infrastructure, finally allowed to do what it was built for. Water sat on Everett's field for 5 days. Water on Ruth's low pasture cleared within a day. The garden, replanted after the first disaster, stood green and untouched.
Weeks later, Everett showed up at Ruth's gate, not to buy mules, but carrying an old survey map his own father had kept, without either of them ever thinking to look at it. "My father used to complain about stray stones in that low field," he said quietly. "Then we start with the stones, not the engine," Ruth told him. By fall, the low pasture looked like it always had from the road, only small markers at each junction showing where the stone lines ran beneath it, placed by Ellie the same patient way she'd once driven wooden stakes into the mud. Cedar and Duke pulled the old plow across ground that finally drained the way it was meant to, their pull even now, unhurried, the discord of that first season long since gone. The mules never found treasure. They found the part of the farm everyone had simply forgotten was still working, waiting under the surface for someone patient enough to listen. Have you ever chosen the slower path for a reason nobody else understood at the time? Have you ever had to admit a failure was really your own impatience and not the tool, the animal, or the weather you wanted to blame instead? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you know someone standing over ground everyone's already written off, send them this tonight. The educational value in this story is simple. Patience and careful observation often reveal solutions that speed and force destroy. Old knowledge, whether in people or in the ground itself, deserves to be understood before it's dismissed, because the fastest path forward isn't always the wisest one.